Hello again. It's like I was just up here. Welcome to Michèle, who you are advising the Clinton campaign.
Informally.
Tell us what your role has been, because I want to leap in with a couple of questions about what she would do in terms of terrorism and national security.
So I am an informal advisor on policy and that kind of thing, but not being a surrogate and so forth.
Without wading too deeply into the swamp of presidential politics, if you had to point to one aspect of national security, counterterrorism policy that would be different under President Clinton than what we've seen these last 8 years under President Obama, what would you point to?
I think that when you listen to Secretary Clinton over the years, one of the consistent themes that she's talked about is the unique leadership role that the United States has to play. And so I think her instinct is to take a more forward-leaning posture towards engagement. Not necessarily military intervention, which she's talked about as a last resort, but using all the instruments of national power so that, potentially coercive instruments like sanctions or the threat of force actually make your diplomacy more effective. So I think she's wants to see the U.S. lean into its leadership role, build coalitions to take on common challenges, and that would include in the counterterrorism arena, among others.
And what does that look like in the counterterrorism arena? When you talk about more forward-leaning, what does that actually mean?
I think, I think that, first of all, trying to get the coalition that's been built more on the same page. We have a lot of great partners in this fight, but they have a lot of objectives that may be somewhat different than our own, and so we don't always get the coherence that we need to be effective on the ground in places like Iraq and Syria. I also think that there's room for, the pressure that our military support to many of these groups on the ground, opposition groups on the ground, is putting on ISIS is very, very important, and that has to be a part of the campaign. But I think one of the questions that interests me is how do we actually get ahead of the threat? So in places where ISIS is thinking about trying to establish a foothold, how do we get ahead of that with cooperation with intelligence and law enforcement, with partners, to try to make the environment very inhospitable to ISIS? And I'll give you one example, is Southeast Asia. I had one of the Southeast Asian defense ministers, who's an old friend, in my office the other day, sort of beside himself, that he's seeing the numbers of potential, ISIS self-proclaimed followers rise in his region, and yet we're not, we don't have a sort of proactive, focused effort the way we did when we saw a violent extremist threat in the Philippines, for example.
And how's he seeing that? Is that through social media that he's tracking that?
He's seeing it through social media, he's seeing it through intelligence reporting, he's seeing it through just tracking the networks that they track in the region. And his point was, if we wait for them to manifest here, it's going to be a much harder problem than if we do some proactive things together to just try to make it an unfriendly territory.
You raised Syria, and let me keep you there for a minute. President Obama has said ISIS will never be defeated until the war in Syria has come to an end, until that situation has been sorted out. Do you agree?
I think there's a lot that can be done and is being done to shrink the caliphate, and eventually, if they lose enough territory, they will revert to becoming a clandestine or covert terrorist organization that's in the shadows. But the Syrian civil war, as we've seen it elsewhere, it's the oxygen for groups like this to thrive in the absence of governance, in the absence of any real state structure. And so I do think as long as you have the Syrian civil war festering in the Middle East, you're going to have a significant terrorism problem, you're going to have a significant migration and refugee problem, you're going to have significant spillover to the neighboring states that could potentially destabilize them. And so I think
that sounds like a yes. We have to fix Syria before you can solve ISIS.
What fixing Syria is a tough question,
Yeah.
But I think my own view is that none of the sides will win this on the battlefield. I mean, there is no military victory that's decisive for anybody that's in the realm of possibility So what you have to do is look at how do we set the conditions for the negotiations to be taken more seriously, to negotiate some sort of devolution or federation, loose federation of Syria.
Last night in New York, Hillary Clinton said, the U.S. will never send ground troops to Iraq again. No ground troops in Syria. Do you agree?
I think,
and how should we think about that, given that there are 5,000 U.S. troops in Iraq?
Yeah,
None of them are ground
I think
troops?
there are special operations forces and others who are in the train, advise, assist, sort of supporting others' mission. I think what I would say is, a major U.S.-led large ground intervention in Syria and Iraq will not solve the problem, because the problem has not, if you were to rank the parts of this on easy to hard, the relatively easy part, although potentially costly, is clearing territory. But then what? The key in these places is you have to figure out who is the hold force. What is the force that is going to govern that space, hold it, be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the population? It's why you can't have Iraqi Shia militias clearing Mosul, because they're not seen as legitimate by the population of Mosul. Ultimately, you have to have a force there that's going to be seen as legitimate by the population, or you're going to have the whole thing revert back to where it was before. So, a large U.S. invasion is not going to solve the fundamental problem. It may make us feel like we're doing something, and we may have a momentary, tactical gain, but it's not going to result in a sustainable solution on the ground. And so that's why we're in this slower, more frustrating, but I think correct approach of finding groups on the ground that have some local legitimacy, that are willing to work with us and try to set the conditions for negotiations.
So it sounds like you believe that the strategy the U.S. has been using is the right one. Maybe more resources, it's going to take time.
Yeah, I think a lot of the elements are correct. But we've taken a very reluctant, incremental approach, whereas I think if we would have more impact if we sort of took the strategy and fully resourced it up front and leaned into it. I think with the same resources, you might have a better impact, or same or slightly larger resources.
Fully resourced meaning what? More money, more troops, more?
I think it's first of all more fully resourced politically. I think really working this coalition and trying to resolve some of the differences with our partners, and doing some negotiating with them to get us on the same page. Secondly, I do think it's more fully resourcing certain aspects of the military campaign without putting large conventional ground formations on the ground. And then all these other dimensions. I think you were just talking about counter-CVE, the counter-narrative, the more proactive approach with intelligence and law enforcement cooperation in areas where ISIS isn't fully manifest yet.
Donald Trump says he has a plan for ISIS, how to beat ISIS, but he's not going to tell us what it is.
Yes, it's the secret plan.
It's a secret plan because he doesn't want to broadcast it to the enemy. Serious question, does he have a point?
I think
I don't think there's a general in history who said it was a good idea to telegraph their plans.
It's a fair point that, there's certain parts of our military plans that shouldn't be broadcast ahead of time to an adversary. But that's not an excuse not to outline in general terms what the plan is, because there's no evidence that he has a plan to accomplish what he says his objective is, which is not only to defeat ISIS, but to defeat ISIS decisively and quickly, which I think it's an open question as whether that's possible, no matter how many U.S. resources you throw at this.
So you're looking for actual details and
I am looking
fleshing out.
for some description that gives us a sense of what he's talking about without telegraphing problematic details to the adversary.
Let me shift gears and ask you, big picture, we're sitting here 15 years after 9/11, and you've been in Washington, a long time. You joined the Pentagon in the first Clinton administration.
So 93, yeah.
Were you here on 9/11?
I was.
Were you at the Pentagon?
I was across the street from the White House.
Okay. As you look at what has been done to try to prevent anything like that from happening again, if you had to point to one thing that has been done really well, that we got right? Thank God we fixed it, and here we are, and we're in a better place today. What would you point to?
I would say two things that go together. One is sustained leadership focus that forces intelligence fusion. So
what does that mean?
When I was Undersecretary, part of my job was going with Secretary Gates or for him to a regular NSC meeting where the president himself would go through this, that would look at every active threat stream, every possible threat to the United States of America, and run it down. And I think one of the reasons we have not had a substantial, complex attack coming from, an outside group coming in is because both Bush and Obama have kept this relentless presidential focus on forcing the intelligence and law enforcement agencies to continue to share, err on the side of putting what you know on the table, put the puzzle pieces together, raise the gaps and the things you're uncertain about when you are, so that maybe others can offer something that helps clear up the picture. But I think that has been sustained across two administrations and is a big part of the reason why we have not had a major 9/11 type of attack.
And I want to follow on that, but let me just give you all a heads up. We're about to take questions. If you have one, raise your hand. We've got mics coming around, and we'll try to get one to you. But when you say sustained, the leadership attention on this problem, what does that actually look like? Are you talking about, say, the creation of the NCTC or the creation of the DNI that's forcing on a daily basis agencies to share information?
Certainly there have been a lot of organizational changes that support that sharing. I think there's been somewhat of there has been a culture change from the need to know and, hoarding information is my power, to I better share this, or else if I don't share it, and at the end of the day, that's part of the problem, I'm going to be held accountable for that.
Which is so counterintuitive.
There is this
in the
desire
business.
to put it all on the table. And then it's down to literally going through specific threat streams, what we know, what we don't know, where are the intelligence gaps, how can we move assets to better cover, are there allies who we can call for their information, really getting into the details of of what's necessary to disrupt and prevent plotting. And I would say the sustained pressure that's put on these groups by our special operations forces and those of our allies.
Okay, well, as we know, intelligence sharing and figuring out how all these institutions should work remains a work in progress. I'll be curious to see where we are
but not
in 5-10
perfect
years.
by any means, and I don't mean to imply that, but it's certainly better now than it was before 9/11.
Gentleman right here, please.
So it sounds like you're talking...
Would you mind just identifying yourself?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
I'm David Dannenberg. I'm just here as an Atlantic subscriber.
Great.
But it sounds like you're talking a lot about offshore balancing, working with regional powers, forming coalitions. I guess my question is this possible with the available regional partners? Do new partners need to be brought in the mix? And how achievable is that given all of the different rivalries between some of those regional partners in the region?
I think in the Middle East case, we have all the right partners in the coalition. It's like 60-something countries. The problem is really for everybody but the United States. ISIS is on the priority list, but for no one is it number one. And so they're all working other agendas at the same time they're helping counter ISIS. I think there are some agreements to be reached with individual allies and cluster of allies, for example, the Gulf states, about how we see the region more broadly. One of the challenges is I don't think the United States has articulated a vision for where we're trying to go in this region. Not that we have the pen and can single-handedly write the history of the Middle East, but to the extent we have levers to pull and we can try to shape where it's going with our allies and partners. Where are we trying to see this go? And I think those are the questions that animate them most. And if we had a more satisfying answer, we might be able to get greater buy-in from them on some of the tactical aspects of the counter-ISIS campaign.
Okay, one more right here.
David Eisenberg, Huffington Post. I think everybody recognizes that at the point when the current kinetic phase of operations against ISIS and other groups ends, the countries in question, Syria, for example, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, are going to be facing monumental reconstruction challenges. And to date, our record on that, to put it politely, has not been very good. It's been documented by groups like Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, which in the interest of full disclosure, I once worked at, John Sopko, Cigar, etc. Before SIGAR went out of business, it issued the final report. Stuart Bowen, the head of SIGAR, called for the creation of a USOCO, U.S. Office of Contingency Operations, in order to better plan for future reconstruction, get people on the same page beforehand. Would you endorse such a thing?
Bring you toward a question.
Yes. Would you endorse that? I mean, what changes would you make in our current approach to reconstruction so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past?
It's a great question. I think the first thing is to start with what you're doing here today, which is try to take an accounting of what should we have learned from the last 15 years. What worked and why, what hasn't worked so well and why. I think the question you're asking is a big one, and we could spend another 15 minutes on it, but I think one of the challenges we've had in reconstruction stabilization is, first of all, it tends to come as an afterthought. It's not integrated as part of the upfront planning, so we underestimate the enormity of the task. Second, we don't resource the US government or the instruments of our power to do this very well. It was a huge effort to just get 1,000 civilians into Afghanistan, and we could only sustain it for a year. We don't it's not the State Department isn't trying, it's that they weren't resourced to be an expeditionary agency. No, we've never done that. And then the third is that I think we too often try to create systems that are familiar to us that we think others should enjoy, as opposed to really assessing what would be sustainable in this context. What is likely to resonate, be sustainable, be manageable, be doable in the local context, rather than sort of aiming for Jeffersonian democracy and, free market, liberal free market.
And just to wrap you up with a specific upcoming test for this, we are hearing a lot about campaigns to take back Mosul and Raqqa in Iraq and Syria, and that the battle plans to actually do that, while not easy, are doable, but that the big question mark is the what comes after piece of it.
I think there the biggest issue is a more fundamental political shift, a decision on the part of the Iraqi government to end its campaign of marginalizing and persecuting the Sunni population and politicians. They have to, this will only work ultimately if there's some effort at re-inclusion of giving resources, some greater self-governance capacity to the Sunnis so that they feel a part of Iraq. If that happens, they won't be inviting ISIS back in. If it doesn't happen, again, this will be clearing at tremendous cost, and the political conditions will once again be fertile for groups like ISIS to come back in if they don't address this fundamental political problem.
Michèle Flournoy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.